We want to bring in a friend of the program, Katie Wanenberg, who we were just speaking about the Inflation Reduction Act a couple of weeks ago. Now, this major policy move by President Biden. Katie, thanks so much for being with us. My first question my first question to you is, we've been hearing about how this is going to be paid for. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget put out this today. They say the changes proposed will likely cost an astronomical $400 to $600 billion. Do you think this will help or hurt inflation with adding this much money into the economy?
Yeah, I think I think there's a couple of things at play here that we have to take into consideration as this has just been announced is, the immediate impact for households and individuals who will, see a dramatic reduction in their student loan debt and the money that is being put back in their pocket, which I do think hasn't maybe been fleshed out enough in some of the analysis or, if I dare say, criticism of the president's decision. But, we are going to see households have more money. And I know one of the issues that we have seen, of course, during COVID and seeing, consumer spending, we've kind of been in this weird space between, consumer spending continues to be high, but we are experiencing some inflation. And so, I think one of the last clips you played before we started talking was, is it going to cancel each other out? Is the student loan repayment startup in January with this forgiveness going to kind of zero-sum game? Plus, what is the economic impact going to be when people do have more money for household expenses each month because they are seeing a reduction in their student loan debt?
No, that's interesting because I was trying to get a handle on this too, because we know inflation went down from June to July. We'll get July's numbers once August wraps up here. But this was such an interesting decision. My other question for you, and I don't know your legal background, if you have one at all, but from an executive standpoint, what is the president's authority? Remember early on when this was kind of percolating in Washington, he had kind of thrown the ball to Congress. He was urging Congress to maybe take action on this, and yet he made this executive decision today. Does he have that right and that authority?
Well, and I think this is going to, find itself in the court. And one of the things I'm sure, Andrew, that you were aware of is the most recent decision related to the EPA that the Supreme Court ruled on before its term concluded this year, or this earlier in the spring, was about, the broad reach in which the administration or agencies have. And so I think that there is some reasonable conversation. Is this within the purview of the president to do by executive order and then the Department of Education to implement? I don't know. I mean, I will say that I think that there are very smart legal minds working in our government. And I'm sure that they've run this through, quite a few scenarios. And so my guess would be at this point, and perhaps that is why this was a little bit more targeted than some advocates had been pushing for at that $50,000 rate or $50,000 level, and perhaps keeping it to $20,000 for Pell Grant and $10,000 for borrowers may strengthen their case for the ability for the president to do this through executive order and through the Department of Education.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good distinction to make with this. This is not like the Paycheck Protection Act. This is not like your stimulus checks, if you were eligible, where it kind of just appears in your bank account. You need to go to a website that has now been created to apply for this, correct?
That's correct. And with more information forthcoming as to how you will be able, I think right now you can go and sign up for more information, but the Department of Education has been tasked with the process to which borrowers can pursue forgiveness. The other thing that I actually want to also flag is this is also eligible for parents who have helped fund their child's education. Same levels account for the $20,000 for Pell Grant, but also the $10,000 that parents may have taken out to help fund their child's college education as well.
Okay, Katie, let's get into some of the political reaction from this today. You had mentioned citing Elizabeth Warren, and we heard that soundbite from her in that story, that it did not go far enough. Well, the chairwoman of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, the Democrat from Washington, she said, well, not as high as we called for, this crucial step from the president keeps his campaign promise. So that's kind of on Biden's left flank. That's where you're hearing from. They're kind of couching it in that language. But then to Biden's right. A lot of Republicans are hammering him for this. Senator Mitch McConnell says Washington Democrats have found yet another way to make inflation even worse. He called it a slap in the face to working families. My question to you is, what do you think President Biden, maybe when he's asked, when he's out and about, when he's traveling, when he's on the campaign trail, if he decides to run in 2024, what is he going to say to Americans who didn't go to college, who paid off their student loan debts the right way, they didn't get any relief? What is the message from the White House to those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are going to have to message this so that people understand that, we've been having a lot of conversations for the last 2 years about, equity and fairness. And I think in some cases, this is really addressing an equity issue where we can acknowledge that there are plenty of people who did not go to college or, made different decisions related to the debt that they were willing to assume or not assume. And so I do think that the White House is going to have to be very particular in talking about the fact that we do in some ways have a broken higher education system. And, this debt is a real burden for many working families who are trying to use that education to have good jobs, to either advance their own lives or the lives of their children. And so I think the White House and the president, even now, even if, take 2024 off the table, but really right now we're going to need to talk about how we can, with this first step, talk about the issues that I think are bigger here, which is, the pathway to higher education is still very limiting. The cost of higher education is becoming insurmountable. I mean, Andrew, I was just looking at some stats. I live in the District of Columbia. I think, George Washington University this year tuition is at $70,000 a year. I mean, we are creating really big barriers, and we put a lot of emphasis on education. And so I know also part of what the president is talking about is continuing to advocate for community college. The Department of Education, through this executive order, is also tasked with addressing what I think is just ridiculous cost for higher education and trying to tamp down those prices for people who really do want to pursue higher education in a meaningful way.
Why do you think the White House chose kind of this two-track policy move? Why did you think they kept in place or at least extended the moratorium on the student loan payments right now? They've been paused since the early days of the pandemic. Why was this extended in conjunction with the $10,000? Was the White House, just trying to keep that campaign promise alive?
I think, part of it is also recognizing that we are moving past our COVID economy and recognizing that one of the things that I do think that was started under the Trump administration with, the deferment of student loan payments while we were navigating those early months and years was really important. But now I think it's actually signaled, I think the White House is signaling to all of us that our economy needs to start looking differently. We're maybe shouldn't be in such an aggressive posture as it relates to COVID. And I would dare say perhaps returning to some level of normalcy. Now, I do think the reason why the administration did announce very forcefully today that this will be the last extension of student loan payment pauses is so that people can plan, so that people can become educated on what is being offered through the student loan debt forgiveness. But they also need to understand that come January 1st, those payments will restart to make sure that people can, I think, plan and budget and, make sure that they're meeting their financial obligation as is. And so while I think it was smart, we also know that the deadline or the most recent extension of the student loan pause was going to expire in August, next Wednesday, I believe. And so I think it also just provided a little bit of a release valve for people to know what they should be expecting from a budgetary perspective.
Definitely, yeah, you're right. This was going to be up August the 31st. My other question, though, Katie, because let's talk about the income caps on this. Do you think it's too high? I mean, individuals making $125,000 a year and then couples jointly making $250,000 or less. To some looking from the outside who didn't go to college or who paid off all their student loans or who are in the middle of paying off all their student loans, that's basically an upper middle class salary in a large regionally majority part of the country. Why do you think they went with those income caps? Could they have brought it down a little bit?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think there's always going to be, arguments for the caps. my guess is that a little bit in response to perhaps some criticism that the administration faced when, the COVID stimulus checks went out during the Biden-Harris administration, and people thought that like the caps were too high. I think they're trying to hit somewhat of a sweet spot. I believe that there's been sufficient amount of research done related to kind of where does the population fall related to the student loan debt and their income. And so, unfortunately, I think this is one of those things where, from both sides, there's going to be argument. It wasn't enough. It was too much. It's too high. It's too low. And I think that, they were really trying to use some research that's been out there that can really target and I think emphasize why they picked these limits and these income thresholds for individuals and married couples filing jointly.
Okay, and I've been just hearing a lot of the criticism, and that's kind of what I wanted to flesh out with you, that this will largely just benefit those upper middle class households, those people who went to premier universities and institutions, and even those with graduate school debt, who went to business school, who went to law school, who are in a very high income tax bracket.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd push back a little bit on that. I think the reason why they also broke out the Pell Grant versus, your Department of Education backed federal loan is, Pell Grants are targeted to households with lower income thresholds. And so I think the strategy there was to recognize that, there are many working families and working individuals who did put themselves through college, did avail themselves of the Pell Grant program. And so seeing that higher threshold for their debt forgiveness, I think is a signal and a recognition to those working families. Now, do I think that there is some criticism that's going to be thrown around as it relates to like this is a middle class tax credit? This is only going to benefit people who went to elite private institutions. Perhaps, but I do think that when you dig into the data, and we'll see what it happens. I mean, the Department of Education is going to have to report out on this program. They're going to have to show that this went to the families and the individuals they were trying to target. And so, we will see this. I think, again, we are in this situation. We're in a very high politically charged environment. I think that this was a campaign promise. I don't think we can totally take away the political nature of the Biden-Harris administration making this decision.
Yeah.
But do I think at the end of the day that this is going to help individuals who are, putting their best foot forward, are working hard, and are trying to provide for themselves and their families? Yes. And, the one thing and I look at things through the business lens, Andrew,
right.
One thing that did stand out to me is the Next Gen Chamber of Commerce did a survey with Capital One. And the respondents were business owners, so millennial business owners, and 30% of them said their student loan debt was impeding their ability to grow their business. And so, there is also the flip side. We talk about inflation. Are we going to see more productivity? Are people who are going to be able to take this, student loan forgiveness, put that money back into their business, grow their business, even start a business? And so I think there's a lot of economic factors, of course, that play into these decisions, but I am very hesitant to immediately bash something hours after it's been announced. But I also do think that there has been enough data out there that we can review and say, okay, this very targeted forgiveness is going to have, I think, a meaningful impact.
That's right. I'm going to be watching for kind of two, data points here, and kind of like you mentioned, the numbers. The Department of Education hopefully will be, accruing and then putting out about the number of applicants, how much money will be forgiven, and how many Americans will take the Biden administration up on this. Also, politically speaking, going into November, will this energize some of those younger generation of voters, those 18 to 30 voters that Biden needs, or at least Democrats need, to keep control of Congress? So a lot in store here, a lot we have to kind of wait and see. Katie Wanenberg, as always, thank you so much.
It was great to be with you, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Great.